Well, hey, um, it is not quite 7, which is good because I'm noticing that my microphone camera, which is also the microphone, is right way up in my grill there. So let me strong arm that a little bit to get a slightly more presentable situation going. It's a little bit of a indication of what a really rough and tumble kind of rig this is that I'm working on. But that is gradually ever so slightly changing. Okay, that is still way up close. I really need something that sits like farther away. So you know what? Instead of having this thing on a boom, I'm going to make an executive production decision. I'm going to cut it free of its constraints. You don't see this on, well, better channels. I don't know. Come on, you. All right. How about, well, crazy. I'm so sorry, you guys. Now I can maybe get the microphone boom out of my face. Almost. Just have to cut the remaining bit of tape off of it. Well, that was exciting. That's actually, yeah, okay. It's not a bad look. I can deal with that. And it is only a minute past 7. I haven't lost too much time. So, hello and welcome back. We are continuing with our Sunday night cold reads. We are going to be proceeding along with Raymond Chandler's The Big Sleep, starting from chapter 16. And it has been observed that this book's problematic in some ways, which I am discovering as I charge headlong into it without having read it first, so to speak. You know, as a queer guy, I could stand to lose a lot of the homophobia stuff. Not cool, Raymond. But the judgment call is to keep going or to quit on this particular story and start something different. And it was kind of a toss-up, honestly. I don't feel like I have a moral or ethical obligation to Mr. Chandler's estate, but I'm this far into the story, and I may not be the only one who's invested in seeing how the story comes out. So let's take a moment to acknowledge that we are on the cusp, I hope, of a time in which things will be more examined. than they have been in the past. And let's move on with our story. Coffee tonight. When we last left off, it was end of chapter 15, and our protagonist, it's really hard to call Philip Marlowe a hero for me, but our protagonist, the detective Philip Marlowe, had just dealt with dust up involving people and guns and this rich girl and all this stuff. Man, cameras will be the death of me. Yeah? Okay? All right, we're sticking with this. It's fine if I can't get up close onto the mic, but we're sticking with this. Nothing but the most professional here. So we're proceeding along to chapter 16. I went over to the folded back French window and looked at the small broken pane in the upper part of it. The bullet from Carmen's gun had smashed the glass like a blow. It had not made a hole. There was a small hole in the plaster, which a keen eye would find quickly enough. I pulled the drapes over the broken pane and took Carmen's gun out of my pocket. It was a banker's special, 22 caliber hollow point cartridges, had a pearl grip, and a small round silver plate set into the butt was engraved, "Carmen, from Owen." She made saps out of all of them. I put the gun back in my pocket and sat down close to Brody and stared into his bleak brown eyes. A minute passed. The blonde adjusted her face by the aid of a pocket mirror. Brody fumbled around with a cigarette and jerked. "Satisfied?" "So far." "Why'd you put the bite on Mrs. Regan instead of the old man?" "Tapped the old man once, about 6-7 months ago. I figure maybe he gets sore enough to call in some law." "What made you think Mrs. Regan wouldn't tell him about it?" He considered that with some care, smoking his cigarette and keeping his eyes on my face. Finally, he said, "How well you know her?" "I've met her twice. You must know her a lot better to take a chance on that squeeze with the photo." "She skates around plenty. I figure maybe she has a couple of soft spots she don't want the old man to know about. I figure she can raise $5,000 easy." "A little weak," I said, "but pass it. You broke, huh?" "Been shaking 2 nickels together for a month, trying to get 'em to mate." "What do you do for a living?" "Insurance. I got desk room in Puss Walgreen's office, Fullwider building, Western and Santa Monica." "And you open up. The book's here in your apartment?" He snapped his teeth and waved a brown hand. Confidence was oozing back into his manner. "Hell no. In storage. You had a man bring them here, and then you had a storage outfit come and take them away again right afterward." "Sure. I don't want to move direct from Giger's place, do I?" "You're smart," I said admiringly. "Anything incriminating in the joint right now?" He looked worried again. He shook his head sharply. "That's fine," I told him. I looked across at Agnes. She had finished fixing her face and was staring at the wall, blank-eyed, hardly listening. Her face had the drowsiness which strain and shock induce after their first incidents. Brody flicked his eyes warily. "Well? How'd you come by the photo?" He scowled. "Listen, you got what you came after. Got it plenty cheap. You done a nice, neat job. Now go peddle it to your top man. I'm clean. I don't know nothing about any photo, do I, Agnes? The blonde opened her eyes and looked at him with vague but uncomplimentary speculation. A half-smart guy, she said with a tired sniff. That's all I ever draw. Never once a guy that's smart all the way around the course. Never once. I grinned at her. Did I hurt your head much? You and every other man I ever met. I looked back at Brody. He was pinching his cigarette between his fingers with a sort of twitch. His hand seemed to be shaking a little. His brown poker face was still smooth. We've got to agree on a story, I said. For instance, Carmen wasn't here. That's very important. She wasn't here. That was a vision you saw. Huh, Brody sneered. If you say so, pal. And if. He put his hand out, palm up, cupped the fingers, and rolled the thumb gently against the index and middle fingers. I nodded. We'll see. There might be a small contribution. You won't count it in grants, though. Now, where did you get the picture? Guy slipped it to me. Really? I am so sorry. Ugh. Wow. Hoist my own petard. Anyway, before my phone rudely interrupted us. Now, where'd you get the picture? Guy slipped it to me. Uh-huh. A guy you just passed in the street. You wouldn't know him again. Never saw him before. Brody yawned. It dropped out of his pocket, he leered. Uh-huh. Got an alibi for last night, poker pan? Sure. I was right here. Agnes was with me. Okay, Agnes? I'm beginning to feel sorry for you again, I said. His eyes flicked wide and his mouth hung loose, the cigarette balanced on his lower lip. You think you're smart, and you're so goddamn dumb, I told him. Even if you don't dance it off up in Quentin, you have such a long, bleak, lonely time ahead of you. His cigarette jerked and dropped ash on his vest. Thinking about how smart you are, I said. Take the air, he growled suddenly. Dust. I got enough chinning with you. Beat it. Okay. I stood up and went over to the tall oak desk and took his 2 guns out of my pocket, laid them side by side on the blotter so that the barrels were exactly parallel. I reached my hat off the floor beside the Davenport and started for the door. Brody yelped, Hey! I turned and waited. His cigarette was jiggling like a doll on a coiled spring. Everything's smooth, ain't it? Why, sure. This is a free country. You don't have to stay out of jail if you don't want to. That is, if you're a citizen. You're a citizen? He just stared at me, jiggling the cigarette. The blonde, Agnes, turned her head slowly and stared at me along the same level. Their glances contained almost the exact same blend of foxiness, doubt, and frustrated anger. Agnes reached her silvery nails up abruptly and yanked a hair out of her head and broke it between her fingers with a bitter jerk. Brody said tightly, You're not going to any cops, brother. Not if it's the Sternwoods you're working for. I got too much stuff on that family. You got your pictures and you got your hush. Go peddle your papers. Make your mind up, I said. You told me to dust. I was on my way out. You hollered at me and I stopped, and now I'm on my way out again. Is that what you want? You ain't got anything on me. Just a couple of murders. Small change in your circle. He didn't jump more than an inch, but it looked like a foot. The white cornea showed all around the tobacco-colored iris of his eyes. The brown skin of his face took on a greenish tinge in the lamplight. Blonde, Agnes, let out a low animal wail and buried her head in a cushion on the end of the Davenport. I stood there and admired the long line of her thighs. Brody moistened his lips slowly and said, "Sit down, pal. Maybe I have a little more for you. What's that crack about 2 murders mean?" I leaned against the door. "Where were you about 7:30 last night, Joe?" His mouth drooped sulkily, and he stared down at the floor. "I was watching a guy who had a nice racket I figured he needed a partner in. Giger. I was watching him now and then to see if he had any tough connections. I figure he has friends or he don't work the racket as open as he does. But they don't go to his house. Only dames." "You didn't watch hard enough," I said. "Go on." "I'm there last night on the street below Giger's house. It's raining hard and I'm buttoned up in my coupe and I don't see anything. There's a car in front of Giger's, another car a little way up the hill. That's why I stay down below. There's a big Buick parked down where I am. After a while, I go over and take a gander into it. It's registered to Vivian Regan. Nothing happens, so I scram. That's all." He waved his cigarette. His eyes crawled up and down my face. "Could be. Know where that Buick is now?" "Why would I?" "It's in the sheriff's garage. It was lifted out of 12 feet of water off Lido Fish Pier this morning. There was a dead man in it. He'd been sapped. The car pointed out the pier and the hand throttle pulled down." Brody was breathing hard. One of his feet tapped restlessly. "Jesus, God, you can't pin that well on me," he said thickly. "Why not? This Buick was down back of Giger's, according to you." "Well, Mrs. Regan didn't have it out. Her chauffeur, a lad named Owen Taylor, had it out. He went over to Giger's place to have words with him because Owen Taylor was sweet on Carmen, and he didn't like the kind of games Giger was playing with her. He let himself in the back way with a jimmy and a gun, and he caught Giger taking a photo of Carmen without any clothes on. So his gun went off, as guns will, and Giger fell down dead, and Owen ran away, but not without the photo negative Giger had just taken. So you ran after him and took the photo from him. How else would you have got hold of it?" Brody licked his lips. "Yeah," he said. "But that don't make me knock him off. Sure, I heard the shots. I saw this killer come slamming down the back steps into the Buick, off. I took out after him. He hit the bottom of the canyon, went west on Sunset. Beyond Beverly Hills, he skidded off the road and had to stop. I came up and played copper. He had a gun, but his nerves was bad. I sapped him down. So I went through his clothes, found out who he was, lifted the plate holder, just out of curiosity. I was wondering what it was all about, getting my neck wet, when he came out of it all of a sudden and knocked me off the car. He was out of sight when I picked myself up. That's the last I saw of him." "How did you know it was Giger he shot?" I asked gruffly. Brody shrugged. "I figure it was. I could be wrong. When I had the plate developed and saw what was on it, I was pretty damn sure. And when Giger didn't come down to the store this morning, didn't answer his phone, I was plenty sure. So I figure it's a good time to move his books out and make a quick touch on the Sternwoods for travel money, blow for a while." "That seems reasonable. Maybe you didn't murder anybody at that. Where did you hide Giger's body?" He jumped his eyebrows. Then he grinned. Nix. Skip it. You think I go back there and handle him, not knowing when a couple carloads of law would come tearing around the corner? Nix. Somebody hid the body." Brody shrugged. The grin stayed on his face. He didn't believe me. While he was still not believing me, the door buzzer started to ring again. Brody stood up sharply, hard eyes. He glanced over at his guns on the desk. "So she's back again," he growled. "If she is, she doesn't have her guns," I comforted him. "Don't you have any other friends?" "Just about one," he growled. "I got enough of this puss in the corner game." He marched to the desk and took the Colt. He held it down at his side and went to the door. He put his left hand to the knob and twisted it, and opened the door a foot and leaned into the opening, holding the gun tight against his thigh. A voice said, "Brody." Brody said something I didn't hear. The two quick reports were muffled. The gun must have been pressed tight against Brody's body. He tilted forward against the door, and the weight of his body pushed it shut with a bang. He slid down the wood. His feet pushed the carpet away behind him. His left hand dropped off the knob, and the arm slapped the door with a thud. His head was wedged against the door. He didn't move. The Colt clung to his right hand. I jumped across the room and rolled him enough to get the door open and crowd through. A woman peered out of a door almost opposite. Her face was full of fright, and she pointed along the hall with a claw-like hand. I raced down the hall and heard thumping feet going down the tile steps and went down after the sound. At the lobby level, the front door was closing itself quietly. Running feet slapped the sidewalk outside. I made the door before it was shut, clawed it open again, and charged out. A tall, hatless figure in a leather jerkin was running diagonally across the street between the parked cars. The figure turned, and flame spurted from it. Two heavy hammers hit the stucco wall beside me. The figure ran on, dodged between two cars, and vanished. A man came up beside me and barked, "What happened?" "Shooting going on," I said. "Jesus!" He scuttled into the apartment house. I walked quickly down the sidewalk to my car, got in and started it. I pulled out from the curb and drove down the hill, not fast. No other car started up on the other side of the street. I thought I heard steps, but I wasn't sure about that. I rode down the hill a block and a half, turned at the intersection, and started back up. The sound of a muted whistling came to me faintly along the sidewalk. Then steps. I double parked, slid out between two cars, and went down low. I took Carmen's little revolver out of my pocket. The sound of the steps grew louder, and the whistling went on cheerfully. In a moment, the jerkins showed. I stepped out between the two cars and said, "Got a match, buddy?" The boy spun towards me, and his right hand darted up to go inside the jerkin. His eyes were a wet shine in the glow of the round electroliers. Moist, dark eyes, shaped like almonds, and a pallid, handsome face with wavy black hair growing low on the forehead in 2 points. A very handsome boy indeed, the boy from Giger's store. He stood there looking at me silently, his right hand on the edge of the jerkin, not inside it yet. I held the little revolver down at my side. "You must have thought a lot of that, Queen," I said. "Go blank, blank." It literally has M dashes. "Go blank yourself," the boy said, motionless between the parked cars and the 5-foot retaining wall on the inside of the sidewalk. A siren wailed distantly coming up the long hill. The boy's head jerked toward the sound. I stepped in close and put my gun into his jerkin. "Me or the cops?" I asked him. His head rolled a little sideways as if I'd slapped his face. "Who are you?" he snarled. "Friend of Giger's." "Get away from me, you son of a bitch." "This is a small gun, kid. I'll give it to you through the navel. Take you 3 months to get you well enough to walk. But you'll get well. So you can walk to the nice new gas chamber up in Quentin." He said, "Go blank yourself." His hand moved inside the jerkin. I pressed harder on his stomach. He let out a long, soft sigh, took his hand away from the jerkin, and let it fall limp at his side. His wide shoulders sagged. "What do you want?" he whispered. I reached inside the jerkin and plucked out the automatic. "Get into my car, kid." He stepped past me, and I crowded him from behind. He got into the car. "Under the wheel, kid. You drive." He slid under the wheel, and I got into the car beside him. I said, "Let the prowl car pass up the hill. They'll think we moved over when we heard the siren. Then turn her downhill, and we'll go home." I put Carmen's gun away and leaned the automatic against the boy's ribs. I looked back through the window. The whine of the siren was very loud now. 2 red lights swelled in the middle of the street. They grew larger and blended into one, and the car rushed by in a wild flurry of sound. "Let's go." The boy swung the car and started off down the hill. "Let's go home," I said. "To Laverne Terrace." His smooth lips twitched. He swung the car west on Franklin. "You're a simple-minded lad. What's your name?" "Carol Lundgren," he said lifelessly. "You shot the wrong guy, Carol. Joe Brody didn't kill your queen." He spoke 3 words to me and kept on driving. End chapter 16. Let me adjust a thing real quick here. There it all is. Okay. Okay, that's better. All right. Chapter 17. A moon half gone from the full glowed through a ring of mist among the high branches of the eucalyptus trees on Laverne Terrace. A radio sounded loudly from a house low down on the hill. The boy swung the car over to the box hedge in front of Giger's house, killed the motor, and sat looking straight before him with both hands on the wheel. No light showed through Giger's hedge. I said, "Anybody home, son?" "You ought to know." "How would I know?" "Go blank yourself." "That's how people get false teeth." He showed me his in a tight grin. Then he kicked the door open and got out. I scuttled out after him. He stood with his fists on his hips, looking silently at the house above the top of the hedge. "All right," I said. "You have a key. Let's go on in." "Who said I had a key?" "Don't kid me, son. The fag gave you one. You've got a nice, clean, manly little room in there. He shooed you out and locked it up when he had lady visitors. He was like Caesar, a husband to women and a wife to men. Think I can't figure people like him and you out?" I still held his automatic more or less pointed at him, but he swung it on me just the same. It caught me flush on the chin. I backstepped fast enough to keep from falling, but I took plenty of the punch. It was meant to be a hard one, but a pansy has no iron in his bones, whatever he looks like. I threw the gun down at the kid's feet and said, "Maybe you need this." He stooped for it like a flash. There was nothing slow about his movements. I sank a fist in the side of his neck. He toppled over sideways, clawing for the gun, not reaching it. I picked it up again and threw it in the car. The boy came up on all fours, leering with his eyes too wide open. He coughed and shook his head. "You don't want to fight," I told him. "You're giving away too much weight." He wanted to fight. He shot at me like a plane from a catapult, reaching for my knees in a diving tackle. I sidestepped, reached for his neck, and took it into chancery. He scraped the dirt hard and got his feet under him, enough to use his hands on me where it hurt. I twisted him around and heaved him a little higher. I took hold of my right wrist with my left hand and turned my right hip bone into him, and for a moment it was a balance of weights. We seemed to hang there in the misty moonlight. two grotesque creatures whose feet scraped on the ground. Whose feet scraped on the ground and whose breath panted with effort. I had my right forearm against his windpipe now, and all the strength of both arms in it. His feet began a frenetic shuffle, and he wasn't panting anymore. He was iron-bound. His left foot sprawled off to one side, and the knee went slack. I held on half a minute longer. He sagged on my arm, an enormous weight I could hardly hold up. Then I let go. He sprawled at my feet, out cold. I went to the car and got a pair of handcuffs out of the glove compartment, twisted his wrists behind him, and snapped them on. I lifted him by the armpits and managed to drag him in behind the hedge, out of sight from the street. I went back to the car and moved it 100 feet up the hill, locked it. He was still out when I got back. I unlocked the door, dragged him into the house, shut the door. He was beginning to gasp now. I switched the lamp on. His eyes fluttered open and focused on me slowly. I bent down, keeping out of the way of his knees, and said, "Keep quiet, or you'll get the same and more of it. Just lie quiet and hold your breath. Hold it until you can't hold it any longer, and then tell yourself that you have to breathe, that you're black in the face, that your eyeballs are popping out, and that you're going to breathe right now, but that you're sitting strapped in the chair in the clean little gas chamber up in San Quentin. And when you take that breath, you're fighting with all your soul not to take it. It won't be air you'll get. It'll be cyanide fumes. And that is what they call humane execution in our state now." "Go blank yourself," he said with a soft, stricken sigh. "You're going to cop a plea, brother. Don't ever think you're not. And you're going to say just what we want you to say, and nothing we don't want you to say. Go blank yourself. Say that again, I'll put a pillow under your head." His mouth twitched. I left him lying on the floor with his wrists shackled behind him and his cheek pressed into the rug and an animal brightness in his visible eye. I put on another lamp and stepped into the hallway at the back of the living room. Giger's bedroom didn't seem to have been touched. I opened the door, not locked now, of the bedroom across the hall from it. There was a dim, flickering light in the room and a smell of sandalwood. 2 cones of incense ash stood side by side on a small brass tray on the bureau. The light came from the 2 tall black candles in the foot-high candlesticks. They were standing on straight-backed chairs, one on either side of the bed. Giger lay on the bed. The 2 missing strips of Chinese tapestry made a St. Andrew's cross over the middle of his body, hiding the blood-smeared front of his Chinese coat. Below the cross, his black pajamaed legs were stiff and straight. His feet were in the slippers with thick white felt soles. Above the cross, his arms were crossed at the wrist, and his hands lay flat against his shoulders, palms down, fingers close together and stretched out evenly. His mouth was closed, and his Charlie Chan mustache was as unreal as a toupee. His broad nose was pinched and white. His eyes were almost closed, but not entirely. The faint glitter of his glass eye caught the light and winked at me. I didn't touch him. I didn't go very near him. He would be as cold as ice and stiff as a board. The black candles guttered in the draft from the open door. Drops of black wax crawled down their sides. The air of the room was poisonous and unreal. I went out, shut the door again, and went back to the living room. The boy hadn't moved. I stood still, listening for sirens. It was all a question of how soon Agnes talked and what she said. If she talked about Giger, the police would be there any minute. But she might not talk for hours. She might even have got away. I looked down at the boy. "Want to sit up, son?" He closed his eye and pretended to go to sleep. I went over to the desk and scooped up the mulberry-colored phone and dialed Bernie Ulls' office. He had left to go home at 6 o'clock. I dialed the number of his home. He was there. "This is Marlowe," I said. "Did your boys find a revolver on Owen Taylor this morning?" I could hear him clearing his throat, and then I could hear him trying to keep the surprise out of his voice. "That would come under the heading of police business," he said. "If they did, it had 3 empty shells in it." "How the hell do you know that?" Oles asked quietly. "Come over to 7244 Laverne Terrace, off Laurel Canyon Boulevard. I'll show you where the slugs went." "Just like that, huh?" "Just like that." Oles said, "Look out the window and you'll see me coming around the corner." "I thought you acted a little cagey on that one." "Cagey is no word for it," I said. End chapter 17. Now, as I mentioned in the tweet that I sent out, this is going to be a 2-hour read tonight, so we got plenty of time. Beginning chapter 18. Oles stood looking down at the boy. The boy sat on the couch, leaning sideways against the wall. Oles looked at him silently, his pale eyebrows bristling and stiff and round, like the little vegetable brushes the Fuller Brushman gives away. He asked the boy, "Do you admit shooting Brody?" The boy said his favorite 3 words in a muffled voice. Oles sighed and looked at me. I said, "He doesn't have to admit that. I have his gun." Oles said, "I wish to Christ I had $1 for every time I've had that said to me. What's funny about it?" "It's not meant to be funny," I said. "Well, that's something," Oles said. He turned away. "I've called Wild. We'll go over and see him, take this punk. You can ride with me and you can follow on behind in case he tries to kick me in the face." "How do you like what's in the bedroom?" "Like it fine," Oles said. "Kind of glad that Taylor kid went off the pier. I'd hate to have to help send him to the death house for rubbing that skunk." I went back into the small bedroom and blew out the black candles and let them smoke. When I got back to the living room, Oles had the boy up on his feet. The boy stood, glaring at him with sharp black eyes, in a face as hard and white as cold mutton fat. "Let's go," Oles said, and took him by the arm as if he didn't like touching him. I put the lamps out and followed them out of the house. We got into our cars, and I followed Oles's twin taillights down the long curving hill. I hoped this would be my last trip to Laverne Terrace. Taggart Wild, the district attorney, lived at the corner of 4th and Lafayette Park, in a white frame house the size of a car barn, with a red sandstone porte cochere built into one side and a couple of acres of soft rolling lawn in front. It was one of those solid, old-fashioned houses, which used to be the thing to move bodily to new locations as the city grew westward. Wild came of an old Los Angeles family and had probably been born in the house when it was on West Adams or Figueroa or St. James Park. There were 2 cars in the driveway already, a big private sedan and a police car with a uniformed chauffeur who leaned smoking against his rear fender and admired the moon. Oles went over and spoke to him, and the chauffeur looked in at the boy in Oles's car. We went up to the house and rang the bell. A slick-haired, blond man opened the door and led us down the hall and through a huge, sunken living room, crowded with heavy, dark furniture, and along another hall on the far side of it. He knocked at a door and stepped inside, then held the door wide and we went into a paneled study with an open French door at the end and a view of dark garden and mysterious trees. A smell of wet earth and flowers came in at the window. There were large, dim oils on the walls, easy chairs, books, a smell of good cigar smoke, which blended with the smell of wet earth and flowers. Taggart Wild sat behind a desk, a middle-aged, plump man with clear blue eyes that managed to have a friendly expression without really having any expression at all. He had a cup of black coffee in front of him, and he held a dappled, thin cigar between the neat, careful fingers of his left hand. Another man sat at the corner of the desk in a blue leather chair, a cold-eyed, hatchet-faced man, lean as a rake and as hard as the manager of a loan office. His neat, well-kept face looked as if it had been shaved within the hour. He wore a well-pressed brown suit, and there was a black pearl in his tie. He had the long, nervous fingers of a man with a quick brain. He looked ready for a fight. Oles pulled a chair up and sat down and said, "Evening, Kronjagger. Meet Phil Marlowe, private eye who's in a jam." Oles grinned. Kronjagger looked at me without nodding. He looked me over as if he was looking at a photograph. Then he nodded his chin about an inch. Wilde said, "Sit down, Marlowe. I'll try to handle Captain Kronjagger, but you know how it is. This is a big city now." I sat down and lit a cigarette. Oles looked at Kronjagger and asked, "What did you get on the Randall Place killing?" The hatchet-faced man pulled one of his fingers until the knuckle cracked. He spoke without looking up. "Stiff. 2 slugs in him. 2 guns that hadn't been fired. Down on the street, we got a blonde trying to start a car that didn't belong to her. Hers was right next to it, same model. She acted rattled, so the boys brought her in, and she spilled. She was in there when this guy Brody got it. Claims she didn't see the killer." "That all?" Oles asked. Kronjagger raised his eyebrows a little. "Only happened about an hour ago. What'd you expect, moving pictures of the killing?" "Maybe a description of the killer," Oles said. "Tall guy in a leather jerkin, if you call that a description." "He's outside in my heap," Oles said. "Handcuffed. Marlowe put the arm on him for you. Here's his gun." Oles took the boy's automatic out of his pocket and laid it on a corner of Wilde's desk. Kronjagger looked at the gun, but didn't reach for it. Wilde chuckled. He was leaning back and puffing his dappled cigar without letting go of it. He bent forward to sip from his coffee cup. He took a silk handkerchief from the breast pocket of the dinner jacket he was wearing and touched his lips with it and tucked it away again. "There's a couple more deaths involved," Oles said, pinching the soft flesh at the end of his chin. Kronjagger stiffened visibly. His surly eyes became points of steely light. Oles said, "You heard about a car being lifted out of the Pacific Ocean off Lido Pier this morning? The dead guy in it?" Kronjagger said, "No," and kept on looking nasty. "The dead guy in the car was chauffeur to a rich family," Oles said. "The family was being blackmailed on account of one of the daughters. Mr. Wilde recommended Marlowe to the family through me. Marlowe played it kind of close to the vest." "I love private dicks that play murders close to the vest," Kronjagger snarled. "You don't have to be so goddamn coy about it." "Yeah," Oles said. "I don't have to be so goddamn coy about it. It's not so goddamn often that I get a chance to be coy with a city copper. I spend most of my time telling them where to put their feet so they won't break an ankle." Kronjagger whitened around the corners of his sharp nose. His breath made a soft hissing sound in the quiet room. He said very quietly, "You haven't had to tell any of my men where to put their feet, smart guy." "We'll see about that," Oles said. "The chauffeur I spoke of that's drowned off Lido shot a guy last night in your territory. A guy named Giger, who ran a dirty book racket in a store on Hollywood Boulevard. Giger was living with the punk I got outside in my car. I mean, living with him, if you get the idea." Kronjagger was staring at him levelly now. "That sounds like it might grow up to be a dirty story," he said. "It's my experience most police stories are," Oles growled, and turned to me, eyebrows bristling. "You're on the air, Marlowe. Give it to him." I gave it to him. I left out 2 things. Not knowing just why at the moment, I left out one of them. I left out Carmen's visit to Brody's apartment and Eddie Mars's visit to Giger's in the afternoon. I told the rest of it just as it happened. Kronjäger never took his eyes off my face, and no expression of any kind crossed his as I talked. At the end of it, he was perfectly silent for a long minute. Wilde was silent, sipping his coffee, puffing gently at his dappled cigar. Oles stared at one of his thumbs. Kronjäger leaned slowly back in his chair and crossed one ankle over his knee and rubbed the ankle bone with his thin, nervous hand. His lean face wore a harsh frown, and he said with deadly politeness, "So all you did was not report a murder that happened last night, and then spend today foxing around so that this kid of Giger's could commit a second murder this evening." "That's all," I said. I was in a pretty tough spot. I guess I did wrong, but I wanted to protect my client. I hadn't any reason to think the boy would go gunning for Brody. That kind of thinking is police business, Marlowe. If Giger's death had been reported last night, the books could never have been moved from the store to Brody's apartment. The kid wouldn't have been led to Brody and wouldn't have killed him. Say Brody was living on borrowed time. His kind usually are, but a life's a life. Right, I said. Tell that to your coppers next time they shoot down some scared petty larceny crook running away up an alley with a stolen spare. Wilde put both of his hands down on his desk with a solid smack. That's enough of that, he snapped. What makes you so sure, Marlowe, that this Taylor boy shot Giger? Even if the gun that killed Giger was found on Taylor's body or in the car, it doesn't absolutely follow that he was the killer. The gun might have been planted, say by Brody, the actual killer. It's physically possible, I said, but morally impossible. It assumes too much coincidence and too much that's out of character for Brody and his girl, and out of character for what he was trying to do. I talked to Brody for a long time. He was a crook, but not a killer type. He had 2 guns, but he wasn't wearing either of them. He was trying to find a way to cut in on Giger's racket, which naturally he knew all about from the girl. Says he was watching Giger off and on to see if he had any tough backers. I believe him. To suppose he killed Giger in order to get his books, then scrammed with the nude photo Giger had just taken of Carmen Sternwood, then planted the gun on Owen Taylor and pushed Taylor into the ocean off Lido, is to suppose a hell of a lot too much. Taylor had the motive, jealous rage, and the opportunity to kill Giger. He was out in one of the family cars without permission. He killed Giger right in front of the girl, which Brody would never have done, even if he had been a killer. I can't see anybody with a purely commercial interest in Giger doing that. But Taylor would have done it. The nude photo business was just what would have made him do it. Wilde chuckled and looked along his eyes at Kronjäger. Kronjäger cleared his throat with a snort. Wilde asked, "What's this business about hiding the body? I don't see the point of that." I said, "The kid hasn't told us, but he must have done it. Brody wouldn't have gone into the house after Giger was shot. The boy must have got home when I was away taking Carmen to her house. He was afraid of the police, of course, being what he is. And he probably thought it a good idea to have the body hidden until he had removed his effects from the house. He dragged it out of the front door, judging by the marks on the rug, and very likely put it in the garage. Then he packed up whatever belongings he had there and took them away. Later on, sometime in the night, before the body stiffened, he had a revulsion of feeling and thought he hadn't treated his dead friend very nicely. So he went back and laid him out on the bed. That's all guessing, of course." Wilde nodded. "Then this morning he goes down to the store as if nothing had happened and keeps his eyes open, and when Brody moved the books out, he found out where they were going and assumed that whoever got them had killed Giger just for that purpose. He may even have known more about Brody and the girl than they suspected. What do you think, Oles?" Oles said, "We'll find out. But that doesn't help Kronjäger's troubles. What's eating him is all this happened last night, and he's only just been rung in on it." Kronjäger said sourly, "I think I can find some way to deal with that angle, too." He looked at me sharply, and immediately looked away again. Wilde waved his cigar and said, "Let's see the exhibits, Marlowe." I emptied my pockets and put the catch on his desk. The 3 notes and Giger's card to General Sternwood, Carmen's photos, and the blue notebook with the code list of names and addresses. I had already given Giger's keys to Oles. Wilde looked at what I gave him, puffing gently at his cigar. Oles lit one of his own toy cigars and blew smoke peacefully at the ceiling. Kronjäger leaned on the desk and looked at what I had given Wilde. Wilde tapped the 3 notes signed by Carmen and said, "I guess these were just a come-on. If General Sternwood paid them, it would be through fear of something worse. Then Giger would have tightened the screws. Do you know what he was afraid of?" He was looking at me. I shook my head. "Have you told your story complete in all relevant details?" "I left out a couple of personal matters. I intend to keep leaving them out, Mr. Wilde." Kronjäger said, "Ah!" and snorted with deep feeling. "Why?" Wilde asked quietly. "Because my client is entitled to that protection, short of anything but a grand jury. I have a license to operate as a private detective. I suppose that word private has some meaning. The Hollywood division has 2 murders on its hands, both solved. They have both killers. They have the motive, the instrument in each case. The blackmail angle has got to be suppressed as far as the names of the parties are concerned." "Why?" Wilde asked again. "That's okay," Kronjäger said dryly. "We're glad to stooge for a Seamus of his standing." I said, "I'll show you." I got up and went back out of the house to my car, and got the book from Giger's store out of it. The uniformed police driver was standing beside Oles' car. The boy was inside it, leaning back sideways in the corner. "Has he said anything?" I asked. "He made a suggestion," the copper said and spat. "I'm letting it ride." I went back into the house and put the book on Wilde's desk and opened up the wrappings. Kronjäger was using a telephone on the end of the desk. He hung up and sat down as I came in. Wilde looked through the book, wooden-faced, closed it and pushed it toward Kronjäger. Kronjäger opened it, looked at a page or 2, shut it quickly. A couple of red spots the size of $50 showed on his cheekbones. I said, "Look at the stamped dates on the front end paper." Kronjäger opened the book again and looked at them. "Well?" "If necessary," I said, "I'll testify under oath that that book came from Giger's store. The blonde, Agnes, will admit what kind of business the store did. It's obvious to anybody with eyes that that store is just a front for something. But the Hollywood police allowed it to operate for their own reasons. I dare say the grand jury would like to know what those reasons are." Wilde grinned. He said, "Grand juries do ask those embarrassing questions sometimes, in a rather vain effort to find out just why cities are run as they are run." Kronjäger stood up suddenly and put his hat on. "I'm 1 against 3 here," he snapped. "I'm a homicide man. If this Giger was running indecent literature, that's no skin off my nose. But I'm ready to admit it won't help my division any to have it washed over in the papers. What do you birds want?" Wilde looked at Oles. Oles said calmly, "I want to turn a prisoner over to you. Let's go." He stood up. Kronjäger looked at him fiercely and stalked out of the room. Oles went after him. The door closed again. Wilde tapped on his desk and stared at me with his clear blue eyes. "You ought to understand how any copper would feel about a cover-up like this," he said. "You'll have to make statements of all of it, at least for the files. I think it may be possible to keep the 2 killings separate and to keep General Sternwood's name out of both of them. Do you know why I'm not tearing your ear off?" "No, I expected to get both ears torn off." "What are you getting for it all?" $25 a day and expenses." I would make $50 and a little gasoline so far. About that. He put his head on one side and rubbed the back of his left little finger along the lower edge of his chin. And for that amount of money, you're willing to get yourself in Dutch with half the law enforcement of this county. I don't like it, I said, but what the hell am I to do? I'm on a case. I'm selling what I have to sell to make a living. What little guts and intelligence the Lord gave me, and a willingness to get pushed around in order to protect a client. It's against my principles to tell as much as I've told tonight without consulting the general. As for the cover-up, I've been in police business myself, as you know. They come a dime a dozen in any big city. Cops get very large and emphatic when an outsider tries to hide anything, but they do the same things themselves every other day to oblige their friends or anybody with a little pull. And I'm not through. I'm still on the case. I'd do the same thing again if I had to. Providing Kronjäger doesn't get your license, Wilde grinned. You said you held back a couple of personal matters. Of what import? I'm still on the case, I said, and stared straight into his eyes. Wilde smiled at me. He had the frank, daring smile of an Irishman. Let me tell you something, son. My father was a close friend of old Sternwood. I've done all my office permits and maybe a good deal more to save the old man from grief. But in the long run, it can't be done. Those girls of his are bound certain to hook up with something that can't be hushed, especially that little blonde brat. They ought not to be running around loose. I blame the old man for that. Guess he doesn't realize what the world is today. And there's another thing I might mention while we're talking man to man, and I don't have to growl at you. I'll bet $1 to a Canadian dime that the general's afraid his son-in-law, the ex-bootlegger, is mixed up in this somewhere. And what he really hoped you would find is that he isn't. What do you think of that? Regan didn't sound like a blackmailer, what I heard of him. He had a soft spot where he was, and he walked out on it. Wilde snorted. The softness of that spot neither you nor I could judge. If he was a certain sort of man, it would not have been so very soft. Did the general tell you he was looking for Regan? He told me he wished he knew where he was, and that he was all right. He liked Regan. He was hurt by the way he bounced off without telling the old man goodbye. Wilde leaned back and frowned. I see, he said in a changed voice. His hand moved the stuff on his desk around, laid Giger's blue notebook to one side, and pushed the other exhibits toward me. You may as well take these. I've no further use for them. And chapter 18. Chapter 19. It was close to 11 when I put my car away and walked around to the front of the Hobart Arms. The plate glass door was put on the lock at 10, so I had to get my keys out. Inside, in the square, barren lobby, a man put a green evening paper down beside a potted palm and flicked a cigarette butt into the tub the palm grew in. He stood up and waved his hat at me and said, The boss wants to talk to you. You sure keep your friends waiting, pal. I stood still and looked at his flattened nose and club-steak ear. What about? What do you care? Just keep your nose clean and everything will be Jake. His hand hovered near the upper buttonhole of his open coat. I smell of policemen, I said. I'm too tired to talk, too tired to eat, too tired to think. But if you think I'm not too tired to take orders from Eddie Mars, try getting your gat out before I shoot your good ear off. Nuts, you ain't got no gun. He stared at me levelly. His dark, wiry brows closed in together and his mouth made a downward curve. That was then, I told him. Not always naked. He waved his left hand. Okay, you win. I wasn't told to blast anybody. You'll hear from him. Too late will be too soon, I said, and turned slowly as he passed me on his way to the door. He opened it and went out without looking back. I grinned at my own foolishness, went along to the elevator and upstairs to the apartment. I took Carmen's little gun out of my pocket and laughed at it. Then I cleaned it thoroughly, oiled it, wrapped it in a piece of Canton flannel and locked it up. I made myself a drink and was drinking it when the phone rang. I sat down beside the table on which it stood. So you're tough tonight, Eddie Mars's voice said. Big, fast, tough, and full of prickles. What can I do for you? Cops over there. You know where. You keep me out of it? Why should I? I'm nice to be nice to, soldier. I'm not nice to not be nice to. Listen hard and you'll hear my teeth chattering. He laughed dryly. Did you? Or did you? I did. Damned if I know why. I guess it was just complicated enough without you. Oh, thanks, soldier. Who gunned him? Read it in the paper tomorrow, maybe. I want to know now. Did you get everything you want? No. Is that an answer, soldier? Somebody you never heard of gunned him. Let it go at that. If that's on the level, someday I may be able to do you a favor. Hang up and let me go to bed? He laughed again. You're looking for Rusty Regan, aren't you? A lot of people seem to think I am, but I'm not. If you were, I could give you an idea. Drop in and see me down at the beach, anytime. Glad to see you. Maybe. Be seeing you then. The phone clicked, and I sat holding it with a savage patience. Then I dialed the Sternwood's number and heard it ring 4-5 times, and then the butler's suave voice saying, General Sternwood's residence. This is Marlowe. Remember me? I met you about 100 years ago. Or was it yesterday? Yes, Mr. Marlowe. I remember, of course. Is Mrs. Regan home? Yes, I believe so. Would you... I cut in on him with a sudden change of mind. No. You give her the message. Tell her I have the pictures, all of them, and that everything is all right. Yes. Yes. The voice seemed to shake a little. You have the pictures, all of them, and everything is all right. Yes, sir. I may say. Thank you very much, sir. The phone rang back in 5 minutes. I had finished my drink, and it made me feel as if I could eat the dinner I had forgotten all about. I went out, leaving the telephone ringing. It was ringing when I came back. It rang at intervals until 12:30. At that time, I put my lights out and opened the windows up, muffled the phone bell with a piece of paper, and went back to bed. I had a bellyful of the Sternwood family. I read all 3 of the morning papers over my eggs and bacon the next morning. Their accounts of the affair came as close to the truth as newspaper stories usually come, as close as Mars is to Saturn. None of the 3 connected Owen Taylor, driver of the Lido Pier suicide car, with the Laurel Canyon exotic bungalow slaying. None of them mentioned the Sternwoods, Bernie Olds, or me. Owen Taylor was chauffeur to a wealthy family. Captain Kronjager of the Hollywood Division got all the credit for solving the 2 slayings in his district, which were supposed to arise out of a dispute over the proceeds from a wire service maintained by one Giger in the back of the bookstore on Hollywood Boulevard. Brody had shot Giger, and Carol Lundgren had shot Brody in revenge. Police were holding Carol Lundgren in custody. He had confessed. He had a bad record, probably in high school. Police were also holding one Agnes Lozelle, Giger's secretary, as a material witness. It was a nice write-up. It gave the impression that Giger had been killed the night before, that Brody had been killed about an hour later, and that Captain Kronjager had solved both murders while lighting a cigarette. The suicide of Taylor made page 1 of Section 2. There was a photo of the sedan on the deck of the power lighter, with the license plate blacked out and something covered with a cloth lying on the deck beside the running board. Owen Taylor had been despondent and in poor health. His family lived in Dubuque, and his body would be shipped there. There would be no inquest. End chapter 19. Chapter 20. Captain Gregory of the Missing Persons Bureau laid my card down on his wide, flat desk and arranged it so that its edges exactly paralleled the edges of the desk. He studied it with his head on one side, grunted, swung around in his swivel chair, and looked out of his window at the barred top floor of the Hall of Justice half a block away. He was a burly man with tired eyes and the slow, deliberate movements of a night watchman. His voice was toneless, flat and uninterested. "Private Dick, eh?" he said, not looking at me at all, but looking out of his window. Smoke wisped from the blackened bowl of a briar that hung on his eye tooth. "What can I do for you?" "I'm working for General Guy Sternwood, 3765 Alta Brea Crescent, West Hollywood." Captain Gregory blew a little smoke from the corner of his mouth without removing the pipe. "On what?" "Not exactly on what you're working on, but I'm interested. I thought you could help me." "Help you on what?" "General Sternwood's a rich man," I said. "He's an old friend of the DA's father. If he wants to hire a full-time boy to run errands for him, that's no reflection on the police. It's just a luxury he's able to afford himself." "What makes you think I'm doing anything for him?" I didn't answer that. He swung around slowly and heavily in his swivel chair and put his large flat feet on the bare linoleum that covered his floor. His office had the musty smell of years of routine. He stared at me bleakly. "I don't want to waste your time, Captain." And I pushed my chair back about 4 inches. He didn't move. He kept on staring at me out of his washed-out, tired eyes. "You know the DA?" "I've met him. I worked for him once. I know Bernie Ulls, his chief investigator, pretty well." Captain Gregory reached for a phone and mumbled into it. "Get me Ulls at the DA's office." He sat holding the phone down on its cradle. Moments passed. Smoke drifted from his pipe. His eyes were heavy and motionless, like his hand. The bell tinkled, and he reached for my card with his left hand. "Ulls. Al Gregory at headquarters. Guy named Philip Marlowe's in my office. Card says he's a private investigator. He wants information from me." "Yeah? What does he look like?" "Okay, thanks." He dropped the phone and took his pipe out of his mouth, tamped the tobacco with the brass cap of a heavy pencil. He did it carefully and solemnly, as if that was as important as anything he would have to do that day. He leaned back and stared at me some more. "What do you want?" "An idea of what progress you're making, if any?" He thought that over. "Regan?" he asked finally. "Sure." "Know him?" "I never saw him. I hear he's a good-looking Irishman in his late 30s, that he was once in the liquor racket, that he married General Sternwood's older daughter, and that they didn't click. I'm told he disappeared about a month back." "Sternwood ought to think himself lucky instead of hiring private talent to beat around in the tall grass." "Well, the general took a big fancy to him. Such things happen. Old man's crippled and lonely. Regan used to sit around with him and keep him company." "What do you think you can do that we can't do?" "Nothing at all, insofar as finding Regan goes. But there's a rather mysterious blackmail angle. I want to make sure Regan isn't involved. Knowing where he is or isn't might help." "Brother, I'd like to help you, but I don't know where he is." He pulled down the curtain, and that's that. Pretty hard to do against your organization, isn't it, Captain? Yeah, but it can be done for a while. He touched a bell button on the side of his desk. A middle-aged woman put her head in at a side door. Give me the file on Terence Regan, Abba. The door closed. Captain Gregory and I looked at each other in some more heavy silence. The door opened up again, and the woman put a tabbed green file on his desk. Captain Gregory nodded her out, put a pair of heavy, horn-rimmed glasses on his veined nose, and turned the paper in the file over slowly. I rolled a cigarette around in my fingers. He blew on the 16th of September, he said. The only thing important about that is it was the chauffeur's day off and nobody saw Regan take his car out. It was late afternoon, though. We found the car 4 days later in a garage belonging to a ritzy bungalow court place near Sunset Towers. Garage man reported it to the stolen car detail, said it didn't belong there. The place is called the Casa de Oro. There's an angle to that I'll tell you about in a minute. We couldn't find out anything about who put the car in there. We print the car, but don't find any prints that are on file anywhere. The car in that garage don't jibe with foul play, although there's a reason to suspect foul play. Jibes with something else I'll tell you about in a minute. I said, that jibes with Eddie Mars's wife being on the missing list. He looked annoyed. Yeah. We investigate the tenants and find out she's living there. Left about the time Regan did, within 2 days anyway. Guy who sounds a bit like Regan had been seen with her, but we don't get a positive identification. It's goddamn funny in this police racket how an old woman can look out of a window and see a guy running and pick him out of a lineup 6 months later, but we can show hotel help a clear photo and they just can't be sure. That's one of the qualifications for good hotel help. Yeah. Eddie Mars and his wife didn't live together, but they were friendly, Eddie says. Here's some of the possibilities. First off, Regan carried 15 grand. Packed it in his clothes all the time. Real money, they tell me. Not just a top card and a bunch of hay. It's a lot of jack, but this Regan might be the boy to have it around so that he could take it out and look at it when somebody was looking at him. Then again, maybe he wouldn't give a damn. His wife says he never made a nickel off old man Sternwood except room and board and a Packard 120 his wife gave him. Tie that for an ex-legger in the rich gravy. Beats me, I said. Well, here we are with a guy who ducks out and has 15 grand in his pants and folks know it. Well, that's money. I might duck out myself if I had 15 grand and me with 2 kids in high school. So the first thought is somebody rolls him for it and rolls him too hard. So they have to take him out to the desert and plant him among the cactuses. I don't like that too well. Regan carried a gat and had plenty of experience using it, not just in a greasy-faced liquor mob. I understand he commanded a whole brigade in the Irish Troubles back in 1922 or whenever it was. A guy like that wouldn't be white meat to a heister. Then his car being in that garage makes whoever rolled him know he was sweet on Eddie Mars's wife, which he was, I guess, but it ain't something every pool room bum would know. Got a photo, I asked? Him, not her. That's funny, too. A lot of funny angles to this case. Here. He pushed a shiny print across the desk, and I looked at an Irish face that was more sad than merry and more reserved than brash. Not the face of a tough guy, and not the face of a man who could be pushed around much by anybody. Straight, dark brows with strong bone under them, a forehead wide rather than high, a mat of dark, clustering hair, a thin, short nose, a wide mouth, a chin that had strong lines but was small for the mouth, a face that looked a little taut, the face of a man who would move fast and play for keeps. I passed the print back. I would know that face if I saw it. Captain Gregory knocked his pipe out, refilled it, tamped the tobacco down with his thumb. He lit it, blew smoke, and began to talk again. Well, there could be people who would know he was sweet on Eddie Mars's Frau, besides Eddie himself. For a wonder he knew it. But he don't seem to give a damn. We checked him pretty thoroughly around that time. Of course, Eddie wouldn't have knocked him off out of jealousy. The setup would point to him too obvious. It depends on how smart he is. He might try the double bluff. Captain Gregory shook his head. If he's smart enough to get by in his racket, he's too smart for that. I get your idea. He pulls the dumb play because he thinks we wouldn't expect him to pull the dumb play. From a police angle, that's wrong. Because he'd have us in his hair, so much it would interfere with his business. You might think a dumb play would be smart. I might think so. The rank and file wouldn't. They'd make his life miserable. I've ruled it out. If I'm wrong, you can prove it on me and I'll eat my chair cushion. Till then, I'm leaving Eddie in the clear. Jealousy is a bad motive for his type. Top-flight racketeers have business brains. They learn to do things that are good policy, let their personal feelings take care of themselves. I'm leaving that out. What are you leaving in? The dame and Regan himself. Nobody else. She was a blonde then, but she won't be now. We don't find her car, so they probably left in it. They had a long start on us, 14 days. Except for that car of Regan's, I don't figure we'd have got the case at all. Of course, I'm used to them that way, especially in good class families. And of course, everything I've done has to be under the hat. He leaned back and thumped the arms of his chair with the heels of his large, heavy hands. I don't see nothing to do but wait, he said. We got readers out, but it's too soon to look for results. Regan had 15 grand we know of. The girl had some, maybe a lot in rocks. But they'll run out of dough someday. Regan will cash a check, drop a marker, write a letter. They're in a strange town and they got new names, but they got the same old appetites. They got to get back in the fiscal system. What did the girl do before she married Eddie Mars? Torture. That is, narrator's break. Torture is spelled Torcher, as in one who torches. Just to be clear. Can't you get any professional photos? Nah. Eddie must have had some, but he won't loosen up. He wants her let alone. I can't make him. He's got friends in town, or he wouldn't be what he is. He grunted. Any of this do you any good? I said, you'll never find either of them. Pacific Ocean's too close. What I said about my chair cushion still goes. We'll find him. May take time. Could take a year or two. General Sternwood may not live that long, I said. We've done all we could, brother. If he wants to put out a reward and spend some money, we might get results. City don't give me the kind of money it takes. His large eyes peered at me, and his scratchy eyebrows moved. You serious about thinking Eddie could put them both down? I laughed. I was just kidding. I think what you think, Captain. Regan ran away with a woman who meant more to him than a rich wife he didn't get along with. Besides, she isn't rich yet. You met her, I suppose. Yeah. She'd make a jazzy weekend, but she'd be wearing for a steady diet. He grunted, and I thanked him for his time and information, and left. A gray Plymouth sedan tailed me away from the city hall. I gave it a chance to catch up with me on a quiet street. It refused the offer, so I shook it off and went about my business. End chapter 20. Still doing pretty good for time. I'm unclear what a torture is. At first I thought they probably meant some kind of arsonist, but when he asked for pictures, I wonder if maybe that's torch singer? These kids and their slang. Chapter 21. I didn't go near the Sternwood family. I went back to the office and sat in my swivel chair, tried to catch up on my foot dangling. There was a gusty wind blowing in at the windows, and the soot from the oil burners of the hotel next door was downdrafted into the room, rolling across the top of the desk like tumbleweed drifting across a vacant lot. I was thinking about going out to lunch, and that life was pretty flat, and that it would probably be just as flat if I took a drink, and that Taking a drink all alone at that time of day wouldn't be any fun anyway. I was thinking this when Norris called up. In his carefully polite manner, he said that General Sternwood was not feeling very well, and that certain items in the newspaper had been read to him, and he assumed that my investigation was now completed. Yes, as regards Giger, I said. I didn't shoot him, you know. The General didn't suppose that you did, Mr. Marlowe. Does the General know anything about those photographs Mrs. Regan was worrying about? No, sir. Decidedly not. Did you know what the General gave me? Yes, sir. 3 notes and a card, I believe. Right. I'll return them. As to the photos, I think I'd better just destroy them. Very good, sir. Mrs. Regan tried to reach you a number of times last night. I was out getting drunk, I said. Yes, very necessary, sir, I'm sure. The General has instructed me to send you a check for $500. Will that be satisfactory? More than generous, I said. And I presume we may now consider the incident closed. Oh, sure. Tight as a vault with a busted time lock. Thank you, sir. I am sure we all appreciate it. When the General is feeling a little better, possibly tomorrow, he would like to thank you in person. Fine, I said. I'll come out and drink some more of his brandy, maybe with champagne. I shall see that some is properly iced, the old boy said, almost with a smirk in his voice. And that was that. We said goodbye and hung up. The coffee shop smell from next door came in at the windows with the soot, but failed to make me hungry. So I got out my office bottle and took the drink and let my self-respect ride its own race. I counted it up on my fingers. Rusty Regan had run away from a lot of money and a handsome wife to go wandering with a vague blonde who was more or less married to a racketeer named Eddie Mars. He had gone suddenly without goodbyes, and there might be any number of reasons for that. The General had been too proud, or at the first interview he gave me, too careful, to tell me the Missing Persons Bureau had the matter in hand. The missing persons people were dead on their feet on it, and evidently didn't think it was worth bothering over. Regan had done what he had done, and that was his business. I agreed with Captain Gregory that Eddie Mars would have been very unlikely to involve himself in a double murder just because another man had gone to town with the blonde he was not even living with. It might have annoyed him, but business is business, and you have to hold your teeth clamped around Hollywood to keep from chewing on stray blondes. If there had been a lot of money involved, that would be different, but 15 grand wouldn't be a lot of money to Eddie Mars. He was no two-bit chiseler like Brody. Giger was dead, and Carmen would have to find some other shady character to drink exotic blends of hooch with. I didn't suppose she would have any trouble. All she would have to do would be to stand on the corner for 5 minutes and look coy. I hoped that the next grifter who dropped the hook on her would play her a little more smoothly, a little more for the long haul than for the quick touch. Mrs. Regan knew Eddie Mars well enough to borrow money from him. That was natural. If she played roulette and was a good loser, any gambling house owner would lend a good client money in a pinch. Apart from this, they had an added bond of interest in Regan. He was her husband, and he had gone off with Eddie Mars's wife. Carol Lundgren, the boy killer with the limited vocabulary, was out of circulation for a long, long time, even if they didn't strap him in a chair over a bucket of acid. They wouldn't, because he would take a plea and save the county money. They all do when they don't have the price of a big lawyer. Agnes Lozelle was in custody as a material witness. They wouldn't need her for that if Carol took a plea. And if he pleaded guilty on arraignment, they would turn her loose. They wouldn't want to open up any angles on Giger's business, apart from which they had nothing on her. That left me. I had concealed a murder and suppressed evidence for 24 hours, but I was still at large and had a $500 check coming. The smart thing for me to do was to take another drink and forget the whole mess. That being the obviously smart thing to do, I called Eddie Mars and told him I was coming down to Los Olindas that evening to talk to him. That was how smart I was. I got down there about 9, under a hard, high October moon It lost itself in the top layers of a beach fog. The Cypress Club was at the far end of the town, a rambling frame mansion that had once been the summer residence of a rich man named DeCazens, and later had been a hotel. It was now a big, dark, outwardly shabby place in a thick grove of wind-twisted Monterey cypresses, which gave it its name. It had enormous scrolled porches, turrets all over the place, stained glass trims around the big windows, big empty stables at the back, a general air of nostalgic decay. Eddie Mars had left the outside much as he found it, instead of making it over to look like an MGM set. I left my car on a street with sputtering arc lights and walked into the grounds along a damp gravel path to the main entrance. A doorman in a double-breasted guard's coat let me into a huge, dim, silent lobby, from which a white oak staircase curved majestically up to the darkness of an upper floor. I checked my hat and coat and waited, listening to music and confused voices behind heavy double doors. They seemed a long way off, and not quite of the same world as the building itself. And then the slim, pasty-faced blonde man who had been with Eddie Mars and the pug at Giger's place came through a door under the staircase, smiled at me bleakly, and took me back with him along a carpeted hall to the boss's office. This was a square room, with a deep, old bay window, and a stone fireplace in which a fire of juniper logs burned lazily. It was wainscoted in walnut, and had a frieze of faded damask above the paneling. The ceiling was high and remote. There was a smell of cold sea. Eddie Mars's dark, sheenless desk didn't belong in the room, but neither did anything made after 1900. His carpet had a Florida suntan. There was a bar-top radio in the corner, and a Severus china tea set on a copper tray beside a samovar. I wondered who that was for. There was a door in the corner that had a time lock on it. Eddie Mars grinned at me sociably and shook hands, and moved his chin at the vault. I'm a pushover for a heist mob here, except for that thing, he said cheerfully. Local Johns drop in every morning and watch me open it. I have an arrangement with them. You hinted you had something for me, I said. What is it? What's your hurry? Have a drink and sit down. No hurry at all. You and I haven't had anything to talk about but business. You'll have the drink and like it, he said. He mixed a couple and put mine down beside a red leather chair and stood cross-legged against the desk himself, one hand in the side pocket of his midnight blue dinner jacket, the thumb outside and the nail glistening. In dinner clothes, he looked a little harder than in gray flannel, but he still looked like a horseman. We drank and nodded at each other. Ever been here before? During Prohibition. I don't get any kick out of gambling. Not with money, he said. You ought to look in tonight. One of your excuse me. Not with money, he smiled. You ought to look in tonight. One of your friends is outside betting the wheels. I hear she's doing pretty well. Vivian Regan. I sipped my drink and took one of his monogrammed cigarettes. I kind of liked the way you handled that yesterday, he said. You made me sore at the time, but I could see afterwards how right you were. You and I ought to get along. How much do I owe you? For doing what? Still careful, huh? I have my pipeline into headquarters, or I wouldn't be here. I get them the way they happen, not the way you read them in the papers. He showed me his large white teeth. How much have you got? I asked. You're not talking money. Well, information was the way I understood it. Information about what? You have a short memory. Regan. Oh, that. He waved his glistening nails in the quiet light from one of those bronze lamps that shoot a beam at the ceiling. I hear you got the information already. I felt I owed you a fee. I'm used to paying for nice treatment. I didn't drive down here to make a touch. I get paid for what I do. Not much by your standards, but I make out. One customer at a time is a good rule. You didn't bump Regan off, did you? No. Did you think that I did? I wouldn't put it past you. He laughed. You're kidding. I laughed. Sure, I'm kidding. I never saw Regan, but I saw his photo. You haven't got the men for the work. And while we're on that subject, don't send me any more gun punks with orders. I might get hysterical and blow one down. He looked through his glass at the fire, set it down on the end of the desk, and wiped his lips with a sheer lawn handkerchief. You talk a good game, he said, but I dare say you can break 110. You're not really interested in Regan, are you? No, not professionally. I haven't been asked to be. But I know somebody who would like to know where he is. She doesn't give a damn, he said. I mean her father. He wiped his lips again and looked at the handkerchief almost as if he expected to find blood on it. He drew his thick gray eyebrows close together and fingered the side of his weather-beaten nose. Giga was trying to blackmail the general, I said. The general wouldn't say so, but I figure he was at least half scared Regan might be behind it. Eddie Mars laughed. Giga worked that one on everybody. It was strictly his own idea. He'd get notes from people that looked legal, were legal, dare say, except he wouldn't have dared sue on them. He'd present the notes with a nice flourish, leaving himself empty-handed. If he drew an ace, he had a prospect that scared and he went to work. If he didn't draw an ace, he just dropped the whole thing. Clever guy, I said. He dropped it all right. Dropped it and fell on it. How come you know all this? He shrugged impatiently. I wish to Christ I didn't know half the stuff that's brought to me. Knowing other people's business is the worst investment a man can make in my circle. Then if it was just Giger you were after, you washed up on that angle. Washed up and paid off. I'm sorry about that. I wish old Sternwood would hire himself a soldier like you on a straight salary. Keep those girls of his home at least a few nights a week. Why? His mouth looked sulky. They're plain trouble. Take the dark one. She's a pain in the neck around here. If she loses, she plunges, and I end up with a fistful of paper, which nobody will discount at any price. She has no money of her own, except an allowance, and what's in the old man's will is a secret. If she wins, she takes my money home with her. You get it back the next night, I said. I got some of it back, but over a period of time, I'm a loser. He looked earnestly at me, as if that was important to me. I wondered why he thought it necessary to tell me at all. I yawned and finished my drink. I'm going to go out and look the joint over, I said. Yes, do. He pointed to a door near the vault door. That leads to a door behind the tables. I'd rather go in the way the suckers enter. Okay, as you please. We're friends, aren't we, soldier? Sure. I stood up and we shook hands. Maybe I can do you a real favor someday, he said. You got it all from Gregory this time. So you own a piece of him too? No, not that bad. We're just friends. I stared at him for a moment, then went over to the door I had come in at. I looked back at him when I had it open. You don't have anybody tailing me around in a gray Plymouth sedan, do you? His eyes widened sharply. He looked jarred. Hell no, why should I? Couldn't imagine, and went on out. I thought his surprise looked genuine enough to be believed. I thought he even looked a little worried. I couldn't think of any reason for that. End of chapter 21. We're on our last half hour. See how far we can go. Chapter 22. It was about 10:30 when the little yellow-sashed Mexican orchestra got tired of playing a low-voiced, prettied-up rumba that nobody was dancing to. The gourd player rubbed his fingertips together as if they were sore, and got a cigarette into his mouth, almost with the same movement. The other four, with a timed, simultaneous stoop, reached under their chairs for glasses from which they sipped, smacking their lips and flashing their eyes. Tequila, their manner said. It was probably mineral water. The pretense was as wasted as the music. Nobody was looking at them. The room had been a ballroom once, and Eddie Mars had changed it only as much as his business compelled him. No chromium glitter, no indirect lighting from behind angular cornices, no fused glass pictures or chairs in violent leather and polished metal tubing. I imagine that was supposed to be violet. I blame the transcription. Violent light. None of the pseudo-modernistic circus of the typical Hollywood night trap. The light was from heavy crystal chandeliers, and the rose damask panels of the wall were still the same rose damask, a little faded by time and darkened by dust, that had been matched long ago against the parquetry floor, of which only a small glass-smooth space in front of the little Mexican orchestra showed bare. The rest was covered by a heavy, old rose carpeting that must have cost plenty. The parquetry was made of a dozen kinds of hardwood, from Burma teak through half a dozen shades of oak and ruddy wood that looked like mahogany, fading out to the hard, pale, wild lilac of the California hills, all laid in elaborate patterns with the accuracy of a transit. It was still a beautiful room, and now there was roulette in it instead of measured, old-fashioned dancing. There were 3 tables close to the far wall. A low bronze railing joined them and made a fence around the croupiers. All 3 tables were working, but the crowd was at the middle one. I could see Vivian Regan's black head close to it, from across the room where I was leaning against the bar and turning a small glass of Bacardi around on the mahogany. The bartender leaned beside me, watching the cluster of well-dressed people at the middle table. "She's picking 'em tonight, right on the nose," he said. "That tall, black-headed frail." "Who is she?" "I wouldn't know her name. She comes here a lot, though." "How the hell you wouldn't know her name?" "I just work here, mister," he said, without any animosity. "She's all alone, too. Guy was with her passed out. They took him out to his car." "I'll take her home." "Hell you will. Well, wish you luck anyways. Should I gentle up that Bacardi, or you like it the way it is?" "I like it the way it is as well as I like it at all," I said. "Me, I'd just as lieve drink croup medicine," he said. The crowd parted, and 2 men in evening clothes pushed their way out, and I saw the back of her neck and her bare shoulders in the opening. She wore a low-cut dress of dull green velvet. It looked too dressy for the occasion. The crowd closed and hid all but her black head. The 2 men came across the room and leaned against the bar and asked for scotch and soda. One of them was flushed and excited. He was mopping his face with a black-bordered handkerchief. The double satin stripes down the side of his trousers were wide enough for tire tracks. "Boy, I never saw such a run," he said in a jittery voice. 8 wins and 2 standoffs in a row on that red. That's roulette, boy. That's roulette." "It gives me the itch," the other one said. "It's betting $1,000 at a crack. She can't lose." They put their beaks in their drinks, gurgled swiftly, and went back. "So wise the little men are," the barkeep drawled. "$1,000 a crack, huh? I saw an old horse-face in Havana once." The noise swelled over at the middle table, and a chiseled foreign voice rose above it, saying, "If you will just be patient a moment, madam, the table cannot cover your bet. Mr. Mars will be here in a moment." I left my Bacardi and padded across the carpet. The little orchestra started to play a tango, rather loud. No one was dancing or intending to dance. I moved through a scattering of people in dinner clothes, full evening dress, and sports clothes and business suits, to the end table at the left. It had gone dead. 2 croupiers stood behind it with their heads together and their eyes sideways. One moved a rake back and forth aimlessly over the empty layout. They were both staring at Vivian Regan. Her long lashes twitched, and her face looked unnaturally white. She was at the middle table, exactly opposite the wheel. There was a disordered pile of money and chips in front of her. It looked like a lot of money. She spoke to the croupier with a cool, insolent, ill-tempered drawl. "What kind of a cheap outfit is this, I'd like to know? Get busy and spin that wheel, High Pockets. I want one more play, and I'm playing table stakes. You take it away fast enough, I've noticed, but when it comes to dishing it out, you start to whine. The croupier smiled a cold, polite smile that had looked at thousands of boors and millions of fools. His tall, dark, disinterested manner was flawless. He said gravely, "The table cannot cover your bet, madam. You have over $16,000 there." "It's your money," the girl jeered. "Don't you want it back?" A man beside her tried to tell her something. She turned swiftly and spat something at him, and he faded back into the crowd, red-faced. A door opened in the paneling at the far end of the enclosed place made by the bronze railing. Eddie Mars came through the door with a set, indifferent smile on his face, his hands thrust into the pockets of his dinner jacket, both thumbnails glistening outside. He seemed to like that pose. He strolled behind the croupiers and stopped at the corner of the middle table. He spoke with lazy calm, less politely than the croupier. "Something the matter, Mrs. Regan?" She turned her face to him with a sort of lunge. I saw the curve of her cheek stiffen, as if with an almost unbearable inner tautness. She didn't answer him. Eddie Mars said gravely, "If you're not playing anymore, you must let me send someone home with you." The girl flushed. Her cheekbones stood out, white in her face, and then she laughed off-key. She said bitterly, "One more play, Eddie. Everything I have on the red. I like red. It's the color of blood." Eddie Mars smiled faintly, then nodded and reached into his inner breast pocket. He drew out a large pin-seal wallet with gold corners and tossed it carelessly along the table to the croupier. "Cover her bet in even thousands," he said. "If no one objects to this turn of the wheel being just for the lady." No one objected. Vivian Regan leaned down and pushed all her winnings savagely with both hands onto the large red diamond on the layout. The croupier leaned over the table without haste. He counted and stacked her money and chips, placed all but a few chips and bills in a neat pile, and pushed the rest back off the layout with his rake. He opened Eddie Mars's wallet and drew out 2 flat packets of $1,000 bills. He broke one, counted 6 bills out, added them to the unbroken packet, put the 4 loose bills in the wallet, and laid it aside as carelessly as if it had been a packet of matches. Eddie Mars didn't touch the wallet. Nobody moved except the croupier. He spun the wheel, left-handed, and sent the ivory ball skittering along the upper edge with a casual flirt of his wrist. Then he drew his hands back and folded his arms. Vivian's lips parted slowly until her teeth caught the light and glittered like knives. The ball drifted lazily down the slope of the wheel and bounced on the chromium ridges above the numbers. After a long time, and then, very suddenly, motion left it with a dry click. After a long time, and then very suddenly, motion left it with a dry click. The wheel slowed, carrying the ball around with it. The croupier didn't unfold his arms until the wheel had entirely ceased to revolve. "The red wins," he said formally, without interest. The little ivory ball lay in red 25, the 3rd number from the 00. Vivian Regan put her head back and laughed triumphantly. The croupier lifted his rake and slowly pushed the stack of $1,000 bills across the layout, added them to the stake, pushed everything slowly out of the field of play. Eddie Mars smiled, put his wallet back in his pocket, turned on his heel, and left the room through the door in the paneling. A dozen people let their breath out at the same time and broke for the bar. I broke with them and got to the far end of the room before Vivian had gathered up her winnings and turned away from the table. I went into the large, quiet lobby, got my hat and coat from the check girl, dropped a quarter in her tray, and went out on the porch. The doorman loomed up beside me and said, "Can I get your car for you, sir?" I said. I'm just going for a walk. The scrollwork along the edge of the porch was wet with the fog. The fog dripped from the Monterey cypresses that shadowed off into nothing toward the cliff above the ocean. You could see a scant dozen feet in any direction. I went down the porch steps and drifted off through the trees, following an indistinct path until I could hear the wash of the surf looking at the fog, down low the bottom of the cliff. There wasn't a gleam of light anywhere. I could see a dozen trees clearly at one time, another dozen dimly, then nothing at all but the fog. I circled to the left and drifted back toward the gravel path that went around to the stables where they parked the cars. When I could make out the outlines of the house, I stopped. A little in front of me, I had heard a man cough. My steps hadn't made any sound on the soft, moist turf. The man coughed again, then stifled the cough with a handkerchief or a sleeve. While he was still doing that, I moved forward, closer to him. I made him out, a vague shadow close to the path. Something made me step behind a tree and crouch down. The man turned his head. His face should have been a white blur when he did that. It wasn't. It remained dark. There was a mask over it. I waited behind the tree. End chapter 22. Chapter 23. Light steps, the steps of a woman, came along the invisible pathway, and the man in front of me moved forward and seemed to lean against the fog. I couldn't see the woman. Then I could see her indistinctly. The arrogant carriage of her head seemed familiar. The man stepped out very quickly. The two figures blended in the fog, seemed to be part of the fog. There was dead silence for a moment. Then the man said, "This is a gun, lady. Gentle now. Sound carries in the fog. Just hand me the bag." The girl didn't make a sound. I moved forward a step. Quite suddenly, I could see the foggy fuzz on the man's hat brim. The girl stood motionless. Then her breathing began to make a rasping sound like a small file on soft wood. "Yell," the man said, "and I'll cut you in half." She didn't yell. She didn't move. There was movement from him and a dry chuckle. "Better be in here," he said. A catch clicked, and a fumbling sound came to me. The man turned and came towards my tree. When he had taken 3 or 4 steps, he chuckled again. The chuckle was something out of my own memories. I reached a pipe out of my pocket and held it like a gun, and called out softly, "Hi, Lanny." The man stopped dead and started to bring his hand up. I said, "No, I never told you to do that, Lanny. You're covered." Nothing moved. The girl back on the path didn't move. I didn't move. Lanny didn't move. "Put the bag down between your feet, kid," I told him. "Slow and easy." He bent down. I jumped out and reached him, still bent over. He straightened up against me, breathing hard. His hands were empty. "Tell me I can't get away with it," I said. I leaned against him and took the gun out of his overcoat pocket. "Somebody's always giving me guns," I told him. "I'm weighed down with them till I walk all crooked." "Beat it." Our breaths met and mingled. Our eyes were like the eyes of 2 tomcats on a wall. I stepped back. "On your way, Lanny. No hard feelings. You keep it quiet and I keep it quiet. Okay?" "Okay," he said thickly. The fog swallowed him. The faint sound of his steps and then nothing. I picked the bag up and felt in it and went towards the path. She still stood there motionless. A gray fur coat held tight around her throat with an ungloved hand, on which a ring made a faint glitter. She wore no hat. Her dark, parted hair was part of the darkness of the night. Her eyes, too. Nice work, Marlowe. You're my bodyguard now. Her voice had a harsh note. Looks that way. Here's the bag. She took it. I said, Have you a car with you? She laughed. I came with a man. What are you doing here? Eddie Mars wanted to see me. I didn't know you knew him. Why? Don't mind telling you. He thought I was looking for somebody he thought had run away with his wife. Were you? No. Then what did you come for? To find out why he thought I was looking for somebody he thought had run away with his wife. Did you find out? No. You leak information like a radio announcer, she said. I suppose it's none of my business, even if the man was my husband. I thought you weren't interested in that. People keep throwing it at me. She clicked her teeth in annoyance. The incident of the masked man with the gun seemed to have made no impression on her at all. Well, take me to the garage, she said. I have to look in at my escort. We walked along the path and around a corner of the building, and there was light ahead. Then another corner, and came to a bright enclosed stable yard lit with 2 floodlights. It was still paved with brick and still sloped down to a grating in the middle. Cars glistened, and a man in a brown smock got up off a stool and came forward. Is my boyfriend still blotto? Vivian asked him carelessly. I'm afraid he is, miss. I put a rug over him and run the windows up. He's okay, I guess. Just kind of resting. We went over to a big Cadillac. The man in the smock pulled the rear door open. On the wide back seat, loosely arranged, covered to the chin with a plaid robe, a man lay snoring with his mouth open. He seemed to be a big blond man who would hold a lot of liquor. Meet Mr. Larry Cobb, Vivian said. Mr. Cobb, Mr. Marlowe. Mr. Cobb was my escort, she said. Such a nice escort, Mr. Cobb. So attentive. You should see him sober. I should see him sober. Somebody should see him sober. I mean, just for the record. Then it could become a part of history. That brief, flashing moment, soon buried in time, but never forgotten, when Larry Cobb was sober. Yeah, I said. I even thought of marrying him, she went on in a high, strained voice, as if the shock of the stick-up was just beginning to get to her. At odd times, when nothing pleasant would come into my mind, we all have those spells. Lots of money, you know. A yacht. Place on Long Island, place at Newport, place at Bermuda. Places dotted here and there all over the world, probably. Just a good Scotch bottle apart. And to Mr. Cobb, a bottle of Scotch is not very far. Yeah, I said. Does he have a driver to take him home? Don't say yeah. It's common. She looked at me with arched eyebrows. The man in the smock was chewing his lower lip hard. Oh, undoubtedly a whole platoon of drivers. They probably do squads right in front of the garage every morning. Buttons shining, harness gleaming, white gloves immaculate, sort of West Point elegance about them. Well, where the hell is this driver? I asked. He drove himself tonight, the man in the smock said, almost apologetically. I could call his home and have somebody come down for him. Vivian turned around and smiled at him as if he had just presented her with a diamond tiara. That would be lovely, she said. Would you do that? I really wouldn't want Mr. Cobb to die like that, with his mouth open. Someone might think he had died of thirst. The man in the smock said, Not if they sniffed him, miss. She opened her bag and grabbed a handful of paper money and pushed it at him. You'll take care of him, I'm sure. Geez, the man said, pop-eyed. I sure will, miss. Regan is the name, she said sweetly. Mrs. Regan. You'll probably see me again. Haven't been here long, have you? No. His hands were doing frantic things with a fistful of money he was holding. You'll get to love it here, she said. She took hold of my arm. Let's ride in your car, Marlowe. It's outside on the street. Quite all right with me, Marlowe. I love a nice walk in the fog. You meet such interesting people. Nuts. She held on to my arm, and began to shake. She held me hard all the way to the car. She had stopped shaking by the time we reached it. I drove down a curving lane of trees on the blind side of the house. The lane opened on De Cousins Boulevard, the main drag of Los Olindas. We passed under the ancient, sputtering arc lights, and after a while there was a town, buildings, dead-looking stores, a service station with a light over a night bell, and at last a drugstore that was still open. "You better have a drink," I said. She moved her chin, a point of paleness in the corner of the seat. I turned diagonally into the curb and parked. "A little black coffee and a smattering of rye would go well," I said. "I could get as drunk as two sailors and love it." I held the door for her, and she got out, close to me, brushing my cheek with her hair. We went into the drugstore. I bought a pint of rye at the liquor counter and carried it over to the stools and set it down on the cracked marble counter. "2 coffees," I said. "Black, strong, made this year." "You can't drink liquor in here," the clerk said. He had a washed-out blue smock, was thin on top as to hair, had fairly honest eyes, and his chin would never hit a wall before he saw it. Vivian Regan reached into her bag for a pack of cigarettes and shook a couple loose, just like a man. She held them towards me. "It's against the law to drink liquor in here," the clerk said. I lit the cigarettes and didn't pay any attention to him. He drew the 2 cups of coffee from a tarnished nickel urn and set them in front of us. He looked at the bottle of rye, muttered under his breath, and said wearily, "Okay, I'll watch the street while you pour it." He went and stood at the display window with his back to us and his ears hanging out. "My heart's in my mouth doing this," I said, and unscrewed the top of the whiskey bottle and loaded the coffee. "The law enforcement in this town is terrific. All through Prohibition, Eddie Mars's place was a nightclub, and they had 2 uniformed men in the lobby every night to see that the guests didn't bring their own liquor instead of buying it from the house." The clerk turned suddenly and walked back behind the counter and went in behind the little glass window of the prescription room. We sipped our loaded coffee. I looked at Vivian's face in the mirror back of the coffee urn. It was taut, pale, beautiful and wild. Her lips were red and harsh. "You have wicked eyes," I said. "What's Eddie Mars got on you?" She looked at me in the mirror. "I took plenty away from him tonight at roulette, starting with $5,000 I borrowed from him yesterday and didn't have to use. That might make him sore. You think he sent that hooligan after you?" Excuse me. I misread. You think he sent that Lugan after you?" "Well, what's a Lugan?" "A guy with a gun." "Are you a Lugan?" "Sure," I laughed. "But strictly speaking, a Lugan is on the wrong side of the fence." I often wonder if there is a wrong side. We're losing the subject. What's Eddie Mars got on you?" "You mean a hold on me of some sort?" "Yes." Her lip curled. "Wittier. Please, Marlowe. Much wittier." "How's the general?" I don't pretend to be witty. "Not too well. He didn't get up today. You could at least stop questioning me. I remember a time when I thought the same about you. How much does the general know?" "He probably knows everything." "Norris would tell him." "No. Wild, the district attorney, was out to see him." "Did you burn those pictures?" "Sure." "You worry about your little sister, don't you? From time to time." "I think she's all I do worry about. I worry about Dad in a way. Keep things from him." "Yeah, he hasn't many illusions," I said, "but I suppose he still has pride." "We're his blood. That's the hell of it." She stared at me in the mirror with deep, distant eyes. "I don't want him to die despising his own blood. It was always wild blood, but it wasn't always rotten blood." "Is it now?" "I guess you think so." "Not yours. You're just playing the part." She looked down. I sipped some more coffee and lit another cigarette for us. So you shoot people, she said quietly. You're a killer. Me? How? The papers and the police fixed it up nicely, but I don't believe everything I read. Oh, you think I accounted for Giger, or Brody, or both of them? She didn't say anything. I didn't have to, I said. I might have, I suppose. Got away with it. Neither of them would have hesitated to throw lead at me. That makes you just a killer at heart, like all cops. Yeah, nuts. One of those dark, deadly, quiet men who have no more feelings than a butcher has for slaughtered meat. I knew it the first time I saw you. You've got enough shady friends to know different. And they're all soft compared to you. Well, thanks, lady. You're no English muffin yourself. Let's get out of this rotten little town. I paid the check, put the bottle of rye in my pocket, and we left. The clerk still didn't like me. We drove away from Las Olindas through a series of little, dank beach towns with shack-like houses built down on the sand, close to the rumble of the surf, and larger houses built back on the slopes behind. A yellow window shone here and there, but most of the houses were dark. The smell of kelp came in off the water and lay on the fog. The tires sang on the moist concrete of the boulevard. The world was a wet emptiness. We were close to Del Rey before she spoke to me for the first time since we left the drugstore. Her voice had a muffled sound, as if something was throbbing deep under it. Drive down by the Del Rey Beach Club. I want to look at the water. It's the next street on the left. There was a winking yellow light at the intersection. I turned the car and slid down a slope with a high bluff on one side. Interurban tracks to the right, a low straggle of light far off beyond the tracks, and then, very far off, a glitter of pier lights, and a haze in the sky over a city. That way, the fog was almost gone. The road crossed the tracks where they turned to run under the bluff, then reached a paved strip of waterfront highway that bordered an open and uncluttered beach. Cars were parked along the sidewalk, facing out to sea, dark. The lights of the beach club were a few hundred yards away. I braked the car against the curb and switched the headlights off, and sat with my hands on the wheel. Under the thinning fog, the surf curled and creamed almost without sound, like a thought trying to form itself on the edge of consciousness. Move closer, she said, almost thickly. I moved out from under the wheel into the middle of the seat. She turned her body a little away from me, as if to peer out of the window. Then she let herself fall backwards, without a sound, into my arms. Her head almost struck the wheel. Her eyes were closed. Her face was dim. Then I saw that her eyes opened and flickered, the shine of them visible even in the darkness. "Hold me close, you beast," she said. I put my arms around her, loosely at first. Her hair had a harsh feeling against my face. I tightened my arms and lifted her up. I brought her face slowly up to my face. Her eyelids were flickering rapidly like moth wings. I kissed her, tightly, quickly, then a long, slow, clinging kiss. Her lips opened under mine. Her body began to shake in my arms. "Killer," she said softly, her breath going into my mouth. I strained her against me until the shivering of her body was almost shaking mine. I kept on kissing her. After a long time, she pulled her head away enough to say, "Where do you live?" "Hobart Arms, Franklin, near Kenmore." "I've never seen it." "Want to?" "Yes," she breathed. "What's Eddie Mars got on you?" Her body stiffened in my arms and her breath made a harsh sound. Her head pulled back until her eyes, wide open, ringed with white, were staring at me. "So that's the way it is," she said in a soft, dull voice. "That's the way it is." Guessing is nice, but your father didn't hire me to sleep with you. You son of a bitch, she said calmly, without moving. I laughed in her face. Don't think I'm an icicle, I said. I'm not blind or without sense. I have warm blood like the next guy. You're easy to take. Too damn easy. What's Eddie Mars got on you? If you say that again, I'll scream. Go ahead and scream. She jerked away and pulled herself upright, far back in the corner of the car. Men have been shot for little things like that, Marlowe. Men have been shot for practically nothing. The first time we met, I told you I was a detective. Get it through your lovely head. I work at it, lady. I don't play at it. She fumbled in her bag and got a handkerchief out and bit on it, her head turned away from me. The tearing sound of the handkerchief came to me. She tore it with her teeth, slowly, time after time. What makes you think he has anything on me? She whispered, her voice muffled by the handkerchief. He lets you win a lot of money and sends a gun poke around to take it back for him. You're not more than mildly surprised. You didn't even thank me for saving it for you. I think the whole thing was just some kind of an act. If I wanted to flatter myself, I'd say it was at least partly for my benefit. You think he can win or lose as he pleases? Sure. On even money bets, 4 times out of 5. Do I have to tell you I loathe your guts, Mr. Detective? You don't owe me anything. I'm paid off. She tossed the shredded handkerchief out of the car window. You have a lovely way with women. I liked kissing you. You kept your head beautifully. That's so flattering. Should I congratulate you or my father? I liked kissing you. Her voice became an icy drawl. Take me away from here, if you will be so kind. I'm quite sure I'd like to go home. You won't be a sister to me. If I had a razor, I'd cut your throat, just to see what ran out of it. Caterpillar blood, I said. I started the car and turned it, and drove it back across the interurban tracks to the highway, and so on into town and up to West Hollywood. She didn't speak to me. She hardly moved all the way back. I drove through the gates and up the sunken driveway to the porte cochere of the big house. She jerked the car door open and was out of it before I had quite stopped. She didn't speak even then. I watched her back as she stood against the door after ringing the bell. The door opened and Norris looked out. She pushed past him quickly and was gone. The door banged shut and I was sitting there looking at it. I turned back down the driveway and home. End chapter 23, and that is our reading for tonight. So we will reconvene next week. 7 p.m. is the plan. But want to mention an interesting thing, sort of development, before I sign off entirely, which is that, interestingly, this week I started a... Where'd you go? I lost my tab. Okay. So interestingly, earlier this week, I started with a distribution company for music stuff. And so I don't know to what extent people are familiar with the music stuff that I've been doing for a long while. The piece that is currently available is an older one. I recorded it initially back in 2007, 2008, thereabouts. But it is available now on Spotify. And I'm just going to post the link. And there is also a Bandcamp that care about that sort of thing. So yeah, for anyone that's curious, it's older work. It's problematic in its way. There's some notes to that effect on the Bandcamp, um, but if anyone cares to go check it out, I'd be obliged. Meantime, you all have a good week. Be safe out there. Take care.